Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. Drew's fingers lingered on the edges of each page as he flipped through the binder, his eyes scanning the words with increasing stiffness in his posture. The room seemed to shrink with each piece of evidence laid bare before him. What began as mild irritation when he first walked in was quickly giving way to a grim awareness that this was not a casual attempt at persuasion, this was a full-scale legal siege. Alexis had not only come prepared, she had armed herself with an arsenal so thorough it left little room for defense. The binders were thick and meticulously tabbed, each section separated by color dividers, each divider a gateway to another area of his life that Alexis had dissected, catalogued, and preserved as ammunition. The first section was a damning chronicle of Scout's disrupted routines. Missed pediatric appointments cross-referenced with calendar entries showing Drew's overlapping meetings in other cities, school progress reports annotated by her teachers noting concerns about absenteeism, and Scout's own attendance logs from the school district, each absence documented with a date, time, and reason that, when strung together, painted a clear pattern of instability. The second section cut even deeper. It was a compilation of witness statements. A music instructor describing how Scout's concentration in class suffered after prolonged absences, a neighbor recalling how often the house sat dark and empty for days at a time when Drew was away on business, a family friend who had been turned down repeatedly when offering to take Scout to visit her late mother's relatives. And then came the photographs. Alexis had chosen them carefully, placing them in chronological order so they told a silent but potent story. A grainy image from a winter recital where Scout stood on stage in her white dress, eyes nervously darting to the side as Drew slipped quietly out the door, phone pressed to his ear. A candid shot from a summer school fair showing Scout sitting alone at a table, her art project untouched, while other children laughed and played with their parents. Another from the sidelines of a soccer game. Drew in the background, looking at his watch, appearing impatient, as if he were counting the minutes until he could leave. Drew's jaw tightened, his breathing slower, heavier. But Alexis wasn't finished. She leaned forward and slid another envelope across the table. This one wasn't part of the neatly bound evidence but something looser, more dangerous. Inside were copies of financial statements, bank transfers, and investment summaries. Documentation of a high-risk business venture Drew had funneled money into, a venture that had teetered on the brink of collapse before narrowly recovering. Alexis knew how to frame this, not as an entrepreneurial gamble, but as reckless financial endangerment. With the right narrative in court, it would look like Drew had been willing to risk the very stability of his household on a speculative bet, an act any family court judge would question when considering the well-being of a child. She didn't stop at the financials. Alexis produced a set of printed emails and text exchanges, highlighting them with a yellow marker so Drew's eyes couldn't miss the key lines. They were all refusals, polite on the surface, but cold in their repetition, declining invitations from Scout's maternal relatives for birthdays, holiday gatherings, and quiet dinners. To the court, Alexis would argue, this was evidence of intentional isolation, a father cutting his daughter off from one of her few remaining emotional anchors after her mother's death. The weight of it pressed on Drew in a way that was different from the normal push and pull of legal threats. This was not an argument he could dismiss with bluster or brush off with a counterpoint. Alexis had built a case that reached into his public record, his private life, and even into the moments he thought had passed unnoticed. She had been watching him with the same precision she used on opposing counsel, only this time, the stakes were personal. Still, Drew's pride refused to fold immediately. He straightened in his chair, trying to cling to the belief that he could fight this, that Martin Gray could counter every claim and turn Alexis's precision against her. But Alexis saw the doubt in his eyes and pressed the advantage. Her voice was calm but edged with steel as she tapped the binder and then the envelope, reminding him that this was just a portion of what she could take into court. If he forced her hand, she said, she would bring in character witnesses, subpoena financial partners, and delve deeper into his decision-making record, every public and private misstep exposed. When she reached into her desk drawer for one final folder, Drew's eyes narrowed. This was different from the rest. It wasn't thick with paper, just a few sheets, but he could feel the shift in the air. Alexis laid it on the table and flipped it open to reveal documents that touched on a subject he had kept buried, a link to a questionable associate and a paper trail that could be construed as an ethical breach. Drew knew immediately that this piece of information, even if misinterpreted, could destroy not only his custody case but also his reputation and career. The silence between them grew heavier, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Drew looked down at the custody transfer agreement that Alexis had already prepared and placed beside the folder, the pen neatly laid on top. His knuckles whitened as he picked up the pen, hovering over the line where his signature would formalize the surrender of full custody to Alexis. He hesitated, a long, bitter pause, before finally pressing the tip to paper and scrawling his name with a force that left the letters sharp and angular, almost carved into the page. As he slid the signed agreement back across the table, Drew's eyes met hers, not with resignation, but with a promise. There was no gratitude, no acceptance. Only the cold, unspoken vow of a man who had been cornered and humiliated but was already thinking several moves ahead, plotting his return. Alexis took the document without a word, her expression unreadable. She had won this battle, but even as she watched Drew stand and leave without another glance, she felt the uneasy knowledge that this was not an ending. It was a fracture, one that would deepen over time, and she could almost see the storm gathering on the horizon. Somewhere deep down, she knew Drew would come back for Scout, and when he did, it would not be with words or appeals. It would be war. Drew's hand lingered on the pen for a fraction longer after signing, the tension in his knuckles almost painful. His signature looked nothing like his usual composed, looping hand, the strokes were jagged, the ink pressed so hard into the paper that faint grooves were left on the desk blotter beneath. He pushed the document toward Alexis with a sharp flick of his wrist, as if severing himself from the act, but the movement carried an undercurrent of rage that no paper could contain. The sound of the pen hitting the table as he released it was sharp and final, a metallic clink that echoed in the heavy stillness between them. Alexis, maintaining her lawyer's poise, drew the signed agreement toward her with slow, deliberate care. She did not gloat, did not smile, did not offer even a murmured acknowledgement. She simply closed the folder and set it neatly atop the other files, her hand resting over it for a moment in quiet possession, as though sealing away not only the custody of Scout but also the culmination of weeks of calculated maneuvering. She met Drew's eyes briefly, long enough for him to read the unspoken truth in hers. She had won this round completely, and she knew it. The air between them was thick with things left unsaid. Drew could feel the heat rising in his chest, a slow, controlled burn that spread with every breath. His mind was a flurry of competing impulses, the urge to lash out, to spit back venom, to remind Alexis that no battle was ever truly over, but his survival instinct urged silence. He could not give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. Instead, he stood, his chair scraping against the floor in a sound that sliced through the tense quiet. As he gathered his coat, Drew's eyes fell on the manila envelope still lying open on the table. The damning financial records inside seemed almost to hum with quiet threat, the edges curling slightly from where Alexis had handled them. He wanted to snatch them up, to rip them apart, to scatter them like confetti across her polished desk, but he knew it would be meaningless. She had copies. Probably secured in multiple locations, with contingencies in place should anything happen to them. The meticulousness of her preparation was infuriating in its inevitability. He turned to leave, his movements clipped and purposeful, but he paused at the door just long enough to let his gaze linger on her one last time. It wasn't a look of defeat, but of cold promise. The message was clear, she had forced his hand today, but this was not over. The custody battle might be decided on paper, but the war for Scout was only beginning, and when he returned, he would not come unprepared. The moment the door closed behind him, the tension he had been holding inside erupted. Drew strode down the hallway of Alexis's office building like a man on the verge of combustion. The rhythm of his footsteps was heavy, purposeful, each one a physical release of the fury that pulsed through him. By the time he reached the elevator, his hand was already fishing his phone from his pocket. He scrolled past the obvious contacts and settled on a number he hadn't dialed in years, someone who owed him a favor, someone who understood that leverage was a more powerful currency than money. His thumb hovered over the call button for a moment before pressing down. When the elevator doors slid closed, the call connected. Drew's voice was low and deliberate, stripped of all pretense. He gave no details, only instructions. He wanted information on Alexis, everything recent, every deal, every client, every personal vulnerability. He wanted the kind of material that didn't just win court cases, but destroyed reputations. As he spoke, his mind began mapping the counteroffensive. Alexis had taken the high ground today, but she had also revealed the lengths she was willing to go, which meant she had weaknesses. The more aggressively she played, the more visible those weaknesses would become. He would bide his time, build his own arsenal, and when the moment came, he would hit her so hard that her victory in that office would feel like nothing more than the first move in a game she couldn't finish. Back upstairs, Alexis remained seated at her desk long after Drew had gone, the closed folder in front of her. She should have felt the satisfaction of a clean win, but a faint unease curled in the pit of her stomach. She had seen that look in Drew's eyes before, not in courtrooms, but in the aftermath of personal betrayals, when the wounded party begins to plot in silence. She knew this custody battle might be over on paper, but her instincts told her the fight for Scout's future was far from finished. Down on the street, Drew stepped into the biting afternoon air, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He walked without destination, letting the city blur around him. Every passerby, every car horn, every gust of wind only fed the fire in his chest. He replayed the scene in Alexis's office over and over, the binder, the envelope, the way she had held the agreement like a prize. Each replay sharpened his resolve. She thought she had cornered him, forced him into surrender. But Drew knew the truth. A man who has been humiliated and stripped of what he loves most is capable of things he might never have considered before. And as he disappeared into the crowd, his mind was already on the first step, finding the one piece of leverage that would make Alexis regret ever thinking she could end this on her terms. Drew's footsteps echoed through the long hallway as he left Alexis's office, each step resonating with the heavy burden of defeat. His mind, once sharp and calculating, now felt clouded by a storm of rage, frustration, and a sense of betrayal that surged with each stride. As the elevator doors closed behind him, the weight of the battle he had just lost pressed down on his chest like an invisible hand, squeezing the air from his lungs. But even as he stood there, staring at the numbers on the elevator display, he knew this defeat was only a temporary one. The cold fire of vengeance smoldered in his veins, growing with every heartbeat. He had been forced to submit, to sign away his daughter's future, but in his mind, the fight was far from over. Drew's thoughts spun wildly as the elevator descended. He'd never been one to back down, especially not when it came to his daughter. Alexis may have won this round, but he wasn't about to let her think she could walk away with Scout. No, this was merely the beginning of a longer, more vicious war. He had never been one to play fair, and now, more than ever, the rules of the game would be his to set. By the time the elevator doors opened to the lobby, Drew's pulse had quickened, his anger flaring hotter with every passing second. He walked swiftly, his movements sharp and purposeful, each one a step away from the office where Alexis had delivered her crushing blow. As he exited the building, the biting chill of the evening air did nothing to calm the fury boiling inside him. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows on the pavement, as if the world itself mirrored the darkness within him. He was alone in this, but in his isolation, a plan began to take shape. The city around him seemed to blur, the hustle of evening traffic fading into the background as his mind raced. He needed to regroup, to regain control, but first, he had to deal with the fallout from today. The thought of losing Scout, even temporarily, twisted in his gut like a knife. He couldn't let her fall into Alexis's hands completely. He wouldn't. Drew's eyes narrowed as he walked past the familiar cityscape, a storm brewing behind his gaze. He was already thinking ahead, already strategizing. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a welcome distraction from the spiraling thoughts. Without hesitation, he pulled it out and dialed a number, his fingers tapping the screen with a new sense of urgency. "Get me everything you have on Alexis," he said, his voice low but hard with the edge of impending action. "I want it all, her financials, her personal dealings, anything and everything. If she's got skeletons in her closet, I want them exposed. I'll pay whatever it takes." The voice on the other end of the line murmured a quick affirmation before the call ended, but Drew didn't wait. He walked with purpose now, his steps no longer burdened by the weight of defeat but propelled by a cold, calculated determination. He knew Alexis was not only a formidable opponent in the courtroom but also a master of controlling her own narrative. He would need to unearth everything she had buried, every secret she had kept hidden. Only then could he begin to turn the tide in his favor. The fight for Scout would not end in Alexis's favor. Drew refused to allow it. Meanwhile, back in Alexis's office, the aftermath of their confrontation was still settling in. She sat motionless, staring at the now signed custody agreement, her fingers lightly touching the edges of the paper as if it were some kind of fragile artifact. She had done it, she had secured full custody of Scout, but a sense of unease was beginning to creep in. Drew's face, his cold, detached expression as he had signed the agreement, haunted her thoughts. She had seen that look before, and it was a look that sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't broken, not by a long shot. If anything, she had just unleashed a sleeping beast. For a moment, Alexis let her mind wander, thinking about what had just transpired. She had won, yes, but the cost of this victory was starting to weigh on her. She had fought for Scout's well-being, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the little girl would be the one who would ultimately suffer the most. Alexis had already taken so much from Drew, his pride, his control, his position as Scout's primary guardian. But Drew was not a man who would stay down for long. She could already feel it in her bones, a storm was coming, and it would tear through everything in its path. Alexis shivered slightly, a sudden coldness wrapping around her. She wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable, not after all her years of legal victories, of carefully navigating through the murky waters of family law. But this felt different. Drew wasn't just a man she had bested in a legal battle, he was a force that would not rest until he reclaimed what he felt was his. And Scout, innocent as she was, would find herself at the center of this clash. The silence in the room felt oppressive now. Alexis glanced over at her phone, where a message from Diane flashed on the screen. It was brief, a simple confirmation that they were moving forward with the legal proceedings. Diane's professional tone was a stark contrast to the swirling doubts Alexis couldn't seem to shake. Yes, she had the legal upper hand, but was it worth the damage it would cause? Drew would not take this loss quietly. He would fight back with everything he had, and this time, the stakes were far higher than before. Alexis knew that this battle was far from over. The victory was hers for now, but the war, that was just beginning. With a deep sigh, Alexis leaned back in her chair, her fingers still tracing the edges of the signed custody agreement. She knew Drew would be relentless in his pursuit of revenge, but what she didn't know was just how far he was willing to go. As the evening light faded outside her window, Alexis felt the weight of what was to come settle into her bones. The first shot had been fired, but it had only scratched the surface of a far more complex and dangerous war. And in the middle of it all, Scout would bear the brunt of the fallout. Alexis glanced back at the door through which Drew had left, the door now closed, but it felt as if he were still standing there, his presence lingering in the air, an unspoken promise of chaos and conflict. She couldn't afford to underestimate him. Not now, not ever. Drew would be back, and when he came, he would come with a fury that would make today's battle look like child's play. With a weary breath, Alexis reached for her phone again. She needed to prepare, to fortify herself for what was sure to come. The next move, whatever it would be, had to be carefully calculated. There was no room for mistakes. There couldn't be. Because in this game of vengeance, there was no second chance. Days passed, and the air in Port Charles grew heavier with unspoken tension. Drew, though beaten in court, had not accepted defeat. Alexis, despite her legal victory, found herself haunted by the growing storm that loomed just beyond the horizon. Each day, as Drew plotted his next move, the pressure on Alexis mounted. The calm before the storm had come to an end, and she could feel the hurricane of his vengeance drawing closer. It was a quiet evening when Alexis received the first sign of Drew's retaliation. A series of emails from anonymous sources landed in her inbox. Sources with information so detailed and precise that Alexis could no longer dismiss them as idle threats. Each email contained new, highly sensitive details about her past, some truths, some half-truths, and some outright fabrications, all aimed at eroding her carefully built reputation.